If you've been on YouTube long enough, chances are you've seen one of WLOP's time-lapse before. The way he paints, his brushworks and color, it's on a whole other level. I've been watching his time-lapse for years now, and I can never follow along with what he's doing. But then I thought, what if I just literally follow along with what he's doing? Wouldn't that help me understand his techniques better? So in this video, I'll be trying to learn how to paint like WLOP. First, by exploring his painterly brushes, then following along with this time-lapse in order to break down his techniques. And finally, applying everything that I've learned into my own attempt. To understand WLOP's style better, I figured the best place to start was his brushes, which there are a lot of. But which of these does he use, and more importantly, how does he use them? So I bought his brush tutorial and found out that his brushes can be categorized into just 5 types. And to understand these brushes better, I'll be using them to recreate this sketch by WLOP. First was the sketch brush, a tiny round brush. But in my opinion, this brush isn't that important. Instead, what stood out to me more was the skin brush, a brush with slight textures, used mainly for blocking values. Despite being called a skin brush, this is actually WLOP's most used brush. You can see him using this brush in pretty much all of his time-lapse. From blocking values all the way to refining skin, hair, clothes, and even adding colors. I did find this brush a bit tricky to use, because unlike typical brushes, this brush has no tapering, so it feels almost like you're sculpting and shaping the form of the character. Next, WLOP uses your default hard brush for adding metal objects like jewelries. The smoothness and sharpness of this brush works really well with contrasting the skin brush. And to further enhance that contrast, a soft brush was used to refine the skin. But what stood out to me was how WLOP uses this brush to add glows to metal, which I tried recreating by brushing the metal with a dark color on color dodge mode. And that instantly made the metal pop. I've always wondered how WLOP gets his metal to look so shiny and polished, and it seems like this was likely the answer. And lastly, but perhaps most importantly, textured brushes. The brushes that creates the painterly look. Here I used 5 different textured brushes, mainly on background, clothes, and hair. The main idea once again was to use textures to create contrast between the smooth skin and hard metal. To me, this feels similar to how contrasting colors complement each other, and in a way, I feel like this also applies to the brushes. So if there's one key takeaway from this brush section, then this would be it. The idea of using softness to contrast with hardness and texture. And this was how the sketch turned out. One final thing, you don't need WLOP's brushes to do any of this, but when I bought his brush tutorial, it came with this tool preset, which gives you quick access to his most used brushes. This was extremely useful for me, so it's what I'll be using throughout this video. But anyways, that was it for my brush practice. Now that's done, I felt more comfortable with tackling the real challenge, painting along with WLOP. Okay, actually, not quite yet, because the first thing that WLOP did was to create a 3D background. Originally, I thought about skipping this part because I was here for the painting process, not 3D modeling. But of course, 3D is a big part of WLOP's work, and I've always been curious about how he combines 3D with 2D so flawlessly. So I thought, why not give this a try? So here's a quick 1-minute overview of how I used Blender to create this background. First, add a cube for the stairs. Then in edit mode, select one of the edges and press Ctrl B, and use scroll wheel to create segments. There's 33 steps in WLOP stairs in total, so I made 66 sections, which then turns into 33 steps. If you're confused about this part, I am too, I'm just following a tutorial. Then I adjusted the size, made a copy, added walls, pillars, and just setting up the scene. Lastly, I set up the light and camera to match WLOP's, and that was it. While I didn't learn how to create crazy 3D works like WLOP's recent works, I did come away with a deeper appreciation of his works, from how he started with these simple scenes to now creating intricate mechanisms. But for now, here's how my background turned out. I then imported it into Photoshop and started the follow-along attempts for real. First thing that WLOP did was add life back into a 3D render. I did this by brushing textures and colors using the skin and textured brushes from earlier. Then I sketched the character. After this came one of the most important steps in WLOP's workflow, value. In most of the time-lapse I watch, WLOP usually starts with black and white values. This might be because working without color lets you focus purely on the fundamentals, things like contrast, light and shadow, and composition. But in this time lapse, WLOP didn't really do that. He kind of started with this desaturated blue instead. Maybe it's because the background was already colored. But in any case, we didn't really get to focus much on values in this part, so it's something I'll revisit later in this video. After this, we then get to a rather unique process in WLOP's workflow, which was coloring with curves. Typically, when I think of curves, I think of a method to brighten or darken an image. But here, the curves tool was used as a way of adding colors to the image. By moving the curves up, you add red, green, or blue. While doing the opposite, adds cyan, magenta, and yellow. So for example, here we want to create a skin tone. So I used the lasso tool to select the skin, then added red by moving the curves up, and introduced a bit of yellow by moving the blue down. That might have sounded confusing, but I think it's much easier to grasp this by just playing around with it yourself. So why do we see this being used in all of WLOP's time-lapse? What makes it so special? My guess would be how coloring with curves preserves the original value, which fits perfectly with WLOP's workflow. So when you color, you can rest assured knowing that your values remain the same. And sure enough, if you compare WLOP's progress to the final results, you can see how the values generally remain the same. Which is kinda crazy, because at this point, we're only 2 minutes in. And also, after this 2 minutes mark, I realized that I don't understand anything. I can still copy his process just fine, but I was getting lost and didn't understand why he was doing things. So I realized that this was the perfect excuse to do a little shopping. And the first thing that I did was to go through a bunch of tutorials for help with skin. Checking out things like lighting scenarios, environment colors, and keys to realism. But my favorite has to be this one on understanding blood flow. Maybe this is common knowledge amongst painters, but the idea of learning about blood flow to paint the skin was crazy to me. It's not that obvious here, but in other of his paintings, you can see how parts like cheeks, nose, and also fingers appears slightly warmer, while parts like forehead, wrist, and the back of hand looks cooler. This, according to WLOP, can make the difference between a realistic skin and a plastic looking one. I then use this knowledge to refine the skin, along with adding subsurface scattering and some bounce light. And at this point, I was still curious about WLOP's composition, so I checked out his composition tutorials. And from what I found, WLOP's approach to composition can be summarized into a single concept: contrast. Contrast between shapes, values, and colors. But one thing that stood out to me was the contrast of textures. Textures between smooth skin against rough fabric, a super detailed face versus the looser, more impressionistic clothing. We don't see much of it here, but WLOP also loves to use shiny, rigid metal to contrast with other rougher elements. And above all, there's one more composition technique that cannot be overlooked, and that is story. Take for example this frame from WLOP's Ghostblade comics. Before this scene was a sequence of stories that helped build up the character and the scene. Having a story behind the art helped guide things like pose, composition, lighting, and just the overall mood and tone. But the part that completely blew me away was the bounce light. WLOP added a bright orange reflection from the hot sand, and even though the sand itself was invisible, you can feel the heat radiating from the environment. Reading WLOP's comics really made me appreciate his storytelling skills more. It's something I never really thought about, but it's such a big part of WLOP's paintings. So if you're interested, I'll leave a link to his Ghostblade comic, as well as his new series below. And just over half of the time-lapse, this is what we have so far. After this was mainly refining the background, but before we get to that, there's actually one part that I completely skipped over. And that was the face. I wasn't planning on talking about my struggles on drawing the face, mainly because I thought it was just a skill issue and had nothing to do with WLOP's style. But I realized that these semi-realistic faces are a big part of WLOP's style. Something I don't have much experience with, as I usually draw dots for a nose. So when I was copying the face, I just couldn't get to look like WLOP's. Worst part is, I knew I had to get this right no matter what. Because with WLOP's style, everything can be somewhat loose and impressionistic, but when it came to the focal points, it has to be the most refined part or else the whole image falls apart. In the end, I got so desperate that I had to overlay the image on top of each other to check the proportions, but I still cannot get it right. And after 4 hours on the face alone, this was how it turned out. And now I can move on to the last parts, refining the background. At this point, I was completely exhausted, so I kind of rushed this last part. I used various textures brushes to refine the ornate pillars and doors, as well as the knights and birds, and that was pretty much it. I don't know what to say, I'm just following along with this time lapse. And after 15 hours, here's how my attempts at painting along with WLOP turned out. It's really good. I'm super happy with how this turned out, but honestly, what really matters is whether I'll be able to use the techniques that we went through in my own attempts. So in this part of the video, I'll be attempting to apply what I learned while focusing on 3 main things. First is painting the black and white values. Second is jewelry. Both are something I want to try doing, but didn't get to do much earlier. And lastly, the face, the part that I struggled with the most. So these were the 3 main focus for my attempts, but to get to do them wasn't as easy as I hoped. So to get started, I opened up the 3D scene from the beginning of this study. I thought it would be nice if I draw the same character, but from a different angle. But long story short, I didn't get far. As you can see, all I've recorded was just me moving around and trying to find that perfect composition for an hour. And by the time they got sketching, I hated both the sketch and the composition. Plus, the idea of drawing this character at a different angle was already done by WLOP himself. So I started over. This time around, for some reason, I decided to draw the character upside down, which made everything super confusing. But despite the wacky sketch, I decided to continue adding values. One thing I didn't expect was how tricky it was to balance white hair, white background, and pure white skin together. And after a couple of hours, I realized that this was as far as I can go with my current skill level. So in this third attempt, let's simplify everything. No more background, no more weird angles, just a straightforward portrait with a character with black hair. Surely that's doable, right? That's horrifying. Okay, one last attempt. These failed attempts made me realize how bad my fundamentals were. So for this attempt, I finally went through tutorials for semi-realistic anatomy. And I should have done this much earlier, because this time around, the sketch looked so much better. Or at least that's what I thought. This is basically a prime example of what happens when you don't study anatomy. But eventually, I got to this point where I felt like I briefly escaped the uncanny valley. Again, I'm not sure why, and I tweaked a bit more, and it got worse. And even worse. I just went back to this version. So if you have any advice for me or some tutorials I should watch to fix this, please let me know. Anyways, after a long ass time and a lot of luck, I got to this point where I was actually happy with the face. Now that's done, I can continue focusing on the values. For skin, I used a combination of soft brush and smudge tool to make it really smooth. And for parts other than skin, I use a lot of textured brushes, which gets thicker as we move away from the focal point. Now for the fun part, jewelries. I started with blocking the shape of the jewelry using rough textured brushes, then slowly refine it using a combination of skin brush and hard brush. WLOP mentioned that the key to making jewelry realistic is randomness, so I made some parts very shiny while some may be super dark. This randomness works because it mimics how light interacts with uneven surfaces, making the jewelry feels realistic. Finally, to make the values pop, I brushed the jewelry with a light color using soft brush with color dodge mode. Also, this time around, instead of drawing everything on one layer like WLOP, I decided to separate them out, which unsurprisingly made things much simpler. Now that the face, jewelry, and the values are done, there's really only one last thing to do. And that was the coloring, which was actually pretty fast. First, I added some greens and blue into the background, then added this blue-red color for the overall ambience. Next, introduced some red to create the skin color, And lastly, made the metal gold and add a slight blue to the black values. And at least for this image, that's kinda it, which makes me feel like I'm doing something wrong because that was so fast. But anyways, I then continued refining the colors, especially by adding warmth and coolness to the skin. And yeah, that was pretty much it, so here's how it turned out. I'm really happy with how this turned out, but it's not quite there yet. Back in 2019, I once tried starting WLOP, but found his techniques to be way too difficult for me. So in a way, I hope this video helped make them feel a bit more approachable. That being said, I don't really understand half of stuff I've been explaining, so I would highly recommend getting others' perspectives, and especially from WLOP himself. But anyways, I hope you found something useful, and as always, thanks for watching.